Greetings, everyone. Greetings, everyone in Moscow. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Professor Tatiana Vячеславовna, and everybody in the room for inviting me to join you for this exciting conference. I hope everyone is healthy, that things will be normal soon, and that we can meet in person. I wish I could be there with you and join in conversation on what is one of my most favorite topics. Let's start with disclaimers. This whole conference is about Dostoevsky, and I have never translated Dostoevsky except quotes that I need now and then. And let me try to share my screen. So with luck, you can see a beautiful PowerPoint. Okay. I hope so. I'm just proceeding on the assumption that you can see it because I can't tell. All right. So in fact, I'm a little bit nervous about this, the topic of the conference, because I've actually never translated Dostoevsky's works into English, right? And I think there are probably some people in the room who do that. And I wish we could talk again. I'm repeating myself, and I wish I could see you. So let us move on. I have some preliminaries for you. And that has to do mostly with the North American and International Dostoevsky Society news and websites. First of all, maybe you already know about the website. It just opened during this bicentennial year. We're very excited about it, and we're hoping this will be a resource that will build a stronger worldwide community of Dostoevsky scholars, translators, readers, and students. And of course, that includes all of you. Founded in 1971, the Society turns 50 years old this year, so we're celebrating an anniversary. Just like the writer whose anniversary we're celebrating. A society is just that, общество, people. And I encourage you to become members at any level from student to donor. Let us see if I can get you to see. Yes, here is, for example, our news section, which features here this very conference. And then I want to make sure everybody knows about the International Symposium, the 18th of the International Dostoevsky Society, which will be in Nagoya, Japan, in March 4th to 8th, 2022. And finally, our journal, Dostoevsky Studies, which goes back a long time, has moved now into online publication, but I think it's even more rigorous now than it's ever been in terms of its a sort of scholarly authority. So keep track of our journal, read the articles, and contribute yourselves. So I should also credit Stefano Aloe from Italy for doing all the hard work, along with Ben-Ami Barros, who is our Executive Secretary of the International Dostoevsky Society, for doing all this work to get the journal online. And the first issue is out already. So today, I'd like us to talk about zooming because we're zooming out and zooming in. We will begin by considering the whole universe of translation and then gradually focus in on details, Russian literature, Dostoevsky, and finally the words. This will be impressionistic, and I will just throw out some big questions as we go along. Проклятые вопросы, большие вопросы. In Tolstoyan terms, or quoting Isaiah Berlin, there's the great history, sweep of history on the one side, the patterns that are visible there, the hedgehog who knows one thing, one theory, one philosophy, and let's say one standard for translation. And the infinite diversity of perspectives and individuals on the other, the fox knows many things, each human being's inner life, all the plant species, all the diagnoses of various diseases, including psychological and emotional, and each translator's unique fingerprint on a work, the craft, With Tolstoy, you zoom out and you see the whole planet in order to see the order of things, and then you zoom in deep into the individual's conscience, where you abide with the character in that moment. I jumped ahead to Dostoevsky, but of course Tolstoy does this. And no order, larger order is in view when we're deep inside the individual. In Dostoevsky's works, it's not the material world that we see when we zoom out, is it? It's the great abstractions, the ideas that torment us all as human beings, and these proklyate vaprosy. Who am I? How did I end up here? Why do I suffer? Is happiness possible? What is to be done? And who is to blame for everything? And with these accursed questions, we're inclined to generalize, as we do when discussing things like Tolstoy's theory of history, Tolstoy's theodicy, and things like that. And my study of translation suggests that these big ideas convey very well in translation, in any translation, though indeed, when you go into philosophy, Notes from Underground, or theology, Brothers Karamazov, and of course the other works as well, the best translators know something about these subjects and can use accepted and clear vocabulary. Mostly, I think, though, readers are deep in Raskolnikov's mind, in the details, the second by second process of his thinking, his cogitating, each of the 730 steps he takes on his pathway to the pawnbroker's apartment. Or the underground man's tautological whirlings around. But, and here's where Dostoevsky's thinkers are unique. Since Raskolnikov's and Ivan's and the underground man's and others' whole problem is that their mental processes are detached from the body. This is the Raskol, one of the Raskols, of course. We're kind of trapped into zooming out, into abstraction, into those big detached ideas. And with the character, we crave wholeness. So these questions arise. Or let's say this question, is it easier to translate? This is a big question number one, if you're gonna, I hope you keep track. Is it easy to translate abstractions like the underground man's rants or Tolstoy's theory of history? Is it easier to translate philosophy, theology, science? I'd call this zooming out. In my experience, I find actually abstractions easier to translate, maybe because abstractions get more universal and understandable from culture to culture. They're detached from realia and the specifics of any individual culture. Or is it easier to translate texts that describe the immediate material environment? Most people think that they are, right? A table is a table. But the more you think about it, nature description, faces and bodies, buildings, streets, foods, clothing, all of them differ depending on their context. What about objects in motion? Gestures, facial expressions, mannerisms, those dreaded Russian verbs of motion, which are so easy if you're a Russian speaker and so difficult if you're a learner of the language. And here we are zooming in on very particular things like what a person looks like when he's walking down the street. How does that convey in language? It's more difficult than we like to think. Is it easier or harder to translate culturally embedded objects themselves? Borscht, samovar, troika, these are the ones that always come up. And, you know, honestly, these are the kinds of words that translators usually just transliterate into English. So you might say they're super easy to translate, right? So what I'm arguing is that with translation too, we grapple with a balance between zooming out and zooming in. And I'd say that translators, for the most part, are at the detail, the foxy end, and critics are at the generalizing, the hedgehoggy end. I find myself doing both practice and criticism, although my practice is not so much translating Dostoevsky as it is translating more modern writers. I'm inclined to appreciate the fine nuances of crafts, and I find myself at the foxy end. So admittedly, impressionistically, I'd like to offer a stick with two ends, palka dvou konцах. Every opinionator aligns along this scale from great to small. One is wild generalization and the other is hair splitting. Both are maddening. The translators in the middle, barraged by criticism from both ends. The worst kind of criticism is one that chooses one example from an 800-page text, shows how the translator used the wrong word, and then deduces from that example that the translation is no good. I call this ED. You can Google this abbreviation in English. I have too much good taste to teach it to you. And I call it error detection. Unfortunately, such criticism is quite influential. The vast majority of those are based on lexicon. The translator, according to the critic, chose the wrong English word for a particular Russian one. Nabokov, of course, is devastating and convincing with this kind of criticism. A slightly higher order cavil or criticism has to do with grammar. A translator's choice for tense, say, might not match what the critic would suggest. In Russian, I think that the alternation between present and past is much freer than it is in English, and that shows itself in text. And it's very, very hard for an English language translator to get it right. In both cases, there's such a thing as error. What Nabokov calls howlers, I would call them, I guess, vopiyushie, da, ошибки. These are more common than you might think. Occasionally, they pop up in my classroom when my students are analyzing a particular excerpt. As a practicing translator, I know the horrifying experience of missing a negative, a nya, in a sentence, or a grammatical ending, which of course can turn the entire meaning upside down. That is why we proofread, and this is why we have editors. I don't think editors get enough credit, by the way. So about some generalities, we're still at the zoomed out end, by the way, if you're keeping track. And I'm on slide number 15. They're going to be 50 in all, so that'll help you settle in, I think. In translation studies, we have entered an exciting era. What I mean is that people are starting to notice translation and think about it seriously in ways that were not common in the academic world until a couple of decades ago. One example is that translation in American universities was never considered to be legitimate intellectual work that would count, for example, in tenure cases. Translation was, or deans and administrators thought, easy, lazy, didn't involve creating new ideas. It's a kind of a service activity, right? Now things have changed in the field as a whole, at least in the West, though not always without loss. Translation studies in its current form is at the far zoom out end, where pesky details like words don't seem to hold much value. And at this zoomed out end, big macro statements can be made. Translations are analyzed as part of an overall social dynamic, which subsumes them to greater political agendas and power struggles. Here, translation seems to hold more universal interest and even more authority to some people. Translation studies, again, at least as it is practiced in the West, now tends to avoid, I think, focusing in on language-specific issues. That is, topics have to do with broader sociological issues. How does translation fit? I've messed up my PowerPoint, I think. I hope you're following along. How does translation fit into the networks of institutional relationships in literary publishing? Let me try, I'm going to try and get into another slide. Sorry to be disconcerting here. There we go. This is what I needed. How does translation fit into networks of institutional relationships in literary publishing? Who gets published? What translators get their work published, or who gets the contracts, right? What role does translation play in transnational relationships among more or less powerful hegemonic entities? Globalization, cultural appropriation, post-colonialism, and so on, all about power in the international world. And here it turns out that English, my language, has a lot of explaining to do about its disregard for literature from other traditions. We translate fewer texts from other literatures than just about any other national tradition. And yes, it's political, and it's about power, and it's about how English drains other literatures of power and appropriates them or ignores them, imposes itself upon other cultures and all kinds of other things, makes other people learn our language if they want to communicate with us. So Another question that people ask is, how do translation dynamics marginalize various peoples? Let's say women's voices. Recently, I'll tell you a couple stories. So recently, I was interviewed as a woman translator, translating women, to glean my views about how my translations elevate the importance of women writers. I do translate a woman writer right now, Alisa Kanieva. I've also translated men. And I can only say in answer to this question, like what's special about being a woman translator or a woman writer is I don't know. It's a craft. I just do the words. Big ideas get in the way. For me, it's all about the words at that far end of the spectrum, the place where details are, or where foxes dance. Here's another example. I translated a Japanese novel. This was a long time ago. It happened to be by a woman. The editors of the publishing house asked me to do another translation and sent me several books to consider, and all of them were by women, and I didn't like any of them. And when I told them that, the editors told me, quote, "Wait, I thought you only translated women writers." And I'd only ever translated one book from Japanese. So there's a certain amount of profiling that goes on. So when I decided to translate German Sadulaev's novel Tabletka, which you may know, it was partially out of defiance as a professional translator. Yes, I am female, and this is very male-rooted, politically incorrect text. But what does my identity have to do with my skill in translating anything? This is what a fox will say. So is it possible to generalize about broad cultural, political, and economic trends from the specifics of any literary translation text? Or would it be more realistic to separate the two realms of inquiry? And by the way, I am not attempting to answer my big questions. I'm just giving them to you. I wish we could talk about them together. So naturally, scholars who generalize feel uneasy with the nuts and bolts of language, the details, and with the meeting points of two specific languages, particularly if they don't know those languages, like mostly Russian. There we go. So that is one way, by the way, that I think that the US and Western world may differ from the Russian tradition, where translation studies at the textual level has always been rich, groundbreaking, important, and valued, I think. I can say that at one time in my life, time when I was actively working as a conference interpreter in the 1990s, I spent some time immersed in the Russian scholarship on interpreting, and the studies were absolutely fascinating, very, very focused in on language, the specifics of language and its encounter with another language, on memory and its role in, for example, consecutive interpreting. I remember Minyar Belaruchev's incredibly detailed system for visual language of note-taking. We're reminded that some of Russia's greatest writers were also translators. And of course, they were amazing translators. This is a very mild statement, of course. In other words, I think that Russia has been at the leading edge of both translation theory and practice. And they are sort of my role models when it comes to the language-specific kind of analysis that goes on. But we don't have this rich tradition in the West. Maybe a function of our focus on English as being so important in the world, our arrogance about that. But we do now have a new focus on translation, and it gives rise to new kinds of challenges. So there's the refuge, I call it, ubежище, right, of the micro, of theorizing, of post-colonial studies of English hegemony and whatnot, that moves way away from the specifics of language. And yet, despite the renewed and welcome attention to translation, not a lot of attention is being paid to the actual text. Indeed, one of my more frustrating recent scholarly activities has been trying to track down English translations of Russian literature. Why? Oh, why is it so hard? For whatever reason, I've wound up recently characterizing the history of English translations of Tolstoy, of Dostoevsky, of Russian classic prose in general, and of Chekhov. If you go on to WorldCat, which is of course the great bibliographic tool, And just for fun, Google, or not Google, but search crime and punishment, you'll see that there are 26,294 results. And the ones that you see don't some of them will mention the translator, but no, not all of them will. So that's an obstacle that you encounter. And speaking of the problems of just disdain, let's say, for translators, let's remind, we might remind ourselves that people don't much care about translators. In fact, it might be sort of annoying for a reader to recognize that what they have in front of them is not Dostoevsky, but somebody else, somebody else's words, that what they might be reading is in fact one of these people. So take the common reader who may not even understand that books can exist in different translations. This may be less something that you encounter in Russia, but it's certainly something we have in the US. An example here might be biblical literalists who live or die on a clause from the Bible without ever realizing that that detail figures only in the translation that their church uses, and that the whole thing was translated from Hebrew or Greek, and that the words translated were spoken maybe even in Aramaic. So one more story for you. This student of mine came to me. I was at just a social event with faculty and students, and a new undergraduate student came. He was 18 years old. He says, he knew I was a Russian literature professor. And he said, "So you teach Russian literature?" He says, and I answered yes. And he asked me, he says, "Do they write that stuff in English or what?" So I think that we teachers do valuable work. I said, "No, actually, Dostoevsky originally wrote in Russian, and it was translated into English." It was a sincere question and a sincere answer. So what about librarians? This is just a student who comes to be educated. I can order copies of different translations, and the librarians, book specialists, will send me whatever version is easiest to find, usually Garnett or Piver Volhonsky. And that too is true. They're just, people are not thinking about translators. So, and this is an interval, but I'm just putting up this slide for you to think about subliminally. Что такое перевод? And have some, not answers, but just some things to think about. First of all, this is a Japanese manga version of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Sumito Batsu. Just a crazy little book. It's published in 1953, and I'll read you the description of the book. Again, translated, I guess, into Japanese with pictures in 1953. This story is based, writes the translator, I guess, or the artist. This story is based on Dostoevsky's novel of the same title and was arranged as a comic strip for children. In pre-revolutionary Russia, Raskolnikov, a poor but cunningly smart student and resident of Petersburg, now Leningrad, murders an old lady, Alyona. According to his philosophy, members of the elite class were free to engage in any illegal activity, including even homicide. Raskolnikov suffers a nervous breakdown, which results in the murder of the old lady. He finally confesses his crime after drawn-out police grillings and on the advice of a poverty-stricken young girl named Sonia. Russia at the time was on the brink of socialist revolution and rebirth of a nation. So I wanted to show you now some pictures from that little version of the novel. Here's Raskolnikov at the doorway. The old lady is letting him in, and then you don't see anything. These are onomatopoeia, boom, boom, boom. The murder is going on. Then he comes out after the murder. So the murder is not depicted in this, right? He comes out, and then the novel takes place in a very short period of time. This is a very short book. I should have calculated the pages for you. And at the end of the novel, this is Sonia. By the way, the Japanese read from right to left, so the sequence is a little different here, right? Sonia tells him here first, go and bow down in the public square, and Raskolnikov goes and does that. And here he is bowing down. This is a 2-page picture, bowing down to the earth with the crowd around him. And then what happens after that appears to me, there's no commentary here, but it appears to me to be the Russian Revolution. So there's a Japanese 1953 version of Crime and Punishment. And while we're on the subject, we have another curio from 1951 in the United States, which is really pretty much the same time. So these comic books were, I guess, a thing at that time. I haven't studied them. Here, the murder is shown, right? And then afterwards, here is Raskolnikov's bowed down to the earth. I'm just thinking that this kind of thing does enter into our mind process when we ask ourselves, what is translation? Что такое перевод? I would say that these two examples reinforce Rachel May's argument. She wrote a classic book about translation of Russian literature in English, came out in 1992 and 93. Politics or an informational bias can skew readers' attention to content and stretch and exaggerate things. But this happens at levels removed from actual problems that actual translators grapple with. That is, how to get this word or this sentence or this paragraph into passable English. So just for balance, I guess we're moving on now. I'm just going to remind you about the sort of order of my talk is from broad hedgehoggy things into more and more narrow focus. So we're now at Russian novels in English and how Dostoevsky's novels fit into that, or his writings generally. There are challenges, there are opportunities here. It's how do we even know how many translations there are, right? If you go through the WorldCat or your bibliographers, they have trouble helping you. That's been my experience at a major research university. So how do we do an authoritative study of translations on the textual level and incorporate the body of text that we have, let's say the corpus of translations into English? I want to return to that at the end. It's okay, in my opinion, to pretend not to be able to generalize when we can analyze and compare key passages from text. And I'll have some suggestions to offer, or I'll ask some more questions. But as far as I know, and I've written articles about these with I'm a little bit nervous about that, because maybe there's something else, maybe there are other translations out there that I don't know about. But there are at least 10 versions of War and Peace, at least 14 of Anna Karenina, 14 of Dead Souls, 14 at least. I'm sure, honestly, I think there are probably more of Notes from Underground. There's at least 12 of Crime and Punishment. We're going to return to that question in a minute. And then at least 8 of the brothers Karamazov, and the latest news, which is really late news, brand new, is that May 14th of 2021, Michael Katz completed his last words of his translation of the brothers Karamazov, which should be out, I guess, I'm going to guess either the end of this year or maybe 2022. So there'll be 8, but I've only mostly read 7 of them. I will give you some examples from that. Originally, with Crime and Punishment, I counted 13 translations. And then I had included in that count Princess Alexandra Kropotkin. She was an interesting person. Maybe you've heard of her. She had everything, a lineage going back to the Romanovs, and the anarchist Prince Alexander Kropotkin, who was her father, an exciting history. She spent time in prison, apparently, for revolutionary activity. She has spent a career writing for women's fashion magazines, including about Russian cuisine. And I should point out that the Russian revolutionaries, not just Kropotkin, but others, have a strong linkage to, so let's say, bourgeois English society during the first couple decades of our century, including the people who taught Constance Garnett Russian. And there's a whole lot of available sources of information about that. So here is her Brothers Karamazov, which I actually have. No, yeah, the Brothers Karamazov. I don't have an image right now of Crime and Punishment. This translation is called credited for translation revised by Princess Alexandra Kropotkin. The date is, I believe, 1949. Yes, the date is 1949. And this whole book is 484 pages long. So quite a bit has cut out of this book for the benefit of readers to save them trouble, including, and I checked, she cut out such wordy and long parts as the Grand Inquisitor. Does not exist in this version. Although the Grand Inquisitor, and I'm doing a little bit of a sideways move here, it does exist in other versions. And in fact, the first English translation from the Brothers Karamazov was done by a certain other interesting, I'm sure, character named Helena Petrova Blavatsky as early as November 1881. She published a version of the Grand Inquisitor, which I have not read. I've not read her version in India, in her journal, The Theosophist, which she founded in Madras. So that's one. And I think this is probably the latest Brothers Karamazov, which actually is not a new translation. It is adapted from the Constance Garnett translation by Natalia Osipova, with the illustrator Elena Avinova. And I love all the graphic versions that are coming out of classic novels. You can read about this, by the way, in the blog, the very active blog of the North American Dostoevsky Society called the Bloggers Karamazov. Please come and read. But back to the princess. She translated War and Peace as well. And I'm just putting that War and Peace. I'm going to hold off on that for a minute. I did include Kropotkin's version of Crime and Punishment in my total of 13 for the novel Crime and Punishment, but then that was abridged as well. But I thought, okay, but then I zoomed in and looked at the text, and I realized, because I was comparing in a micro analysis of certain passages, that her text basically is the same as the first translation of Crime and Punishment by Frederick Wishaw, which is from 1855. So I subtracted her version from my total of 13, and now I think they're just 12, and here are 11 of them, and you can see them behind my head. I'm just going to show you in my vision of me, which I'm not doing very well at, but they're up there on my bookshelf. I don't have Michael Scammell up there, but I got all the others. Now, let's just take an interval for big question number 4. Do we need this many translations of any one novel? Not going to answer that. The fact that so many Russian classic novels exist in so many English translations offers us fascinating opportunities for study that are not available when analyzing most translations. For example, of modern literature or of old books that for whatever reason did not become classics, but do not exist in, say, one translation. So translations of the classics allow us a unique opportunity for really doing microanalysis of text, but incorporating that into potentially really authoritative big generalizations. And by the way, if you're counting, I'm on slide now, number 40 out of 50. So everybody should know that. Now, everybody wants to know, this is the first question people ask, right? Which is the best translation? Which is the best translation? I don't like this question. I have my own views. What we do when we study translations at the hedgehog end, the macro end, the end that insists that there's a hierarchy of translations of any classic that runs absolutely from worst to best. Douglas Robinson attacks this approach to translation theory, offering as his target the whipping boy of equivalence. That is, the assumption that there's an absolute standard by which translations can be measured, that they align appropriately, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, from worst to best or vice versa. Scholars and critics can measure this and can come up with a list, and this list will enable readers to choose the very best translation. And in doing so, they'll get closer to the original author. Translators like Piver and Volokhonsky have the benefit of a reputation of bestseller. Their works come out as bestsellers, and so they have their own kind of, let's just say, noise that reaches readers, and readers just assume that they must be number one, and then they buy the books, right? I'm not making a statement one way or the other as to anybody's quality, although I do see bad translations sometimes, and I like to avoid them. I don't see that any of the Crime and Punishment translations are just bad, you know? I think that any acting and practicing translator is fully aware that it's impossible to analyze each translation to the extent that we can determine absolutely and unambiguously that this is the very best. So I personally do have my favorites, and I think that these translators are superb and they deserve some credit, in particular Oliver Reddy's 2014 Crime and Punishment. It's just fine craft. When it comes to the brothers Karamazov, you know, Constance Garnett keeps getting revised and revised and revised because people try and they think they're going to translate a new one, but then hers is so good that they just tweak it, you know, and make edits in it. I personally love Boris Jakim's work. He's done a lot of Dostoevsky prose from the early 1860s, and notably 2009, his Notes from Underground, but also House of the Dead and some other works from that period. So it may be coincidental that I don't have a particular favorite of Brothers Karamazov, having said that I like Constance Garnett. And it might not be a coincidence that there are just not that many of that novel out there. I will say that I like the Maud's War and Peace, but that doesn't mean that the other translations of that novel aren't good either. So down here on the ground, as opposed to the lofty heights of academe, the good translator is not thinking about which translator is best. She's just which one or how to enhance a message of women's rights through her translation practice. She's just trying to get through the sentence. The good translator is a fox. And one good thing about Dostoevsky in English translation in 2021 is that we have a lot of foxes who've brought us their versions of the novel. So my two answers, I said I wasn't going to answer, but I'll just say something. There are good things about each translation. I have my favorites, and so do you. But don't let the marketing people or primitive ED critics, error detectors, sway you into buying the one version they happen to be trying to sell you. Take Constance Garnett, and now we're moving in to specifics of language here. Her Brothers Karamazov, 1912, is the first complete one in English. She has two unmatched skills. One, no translator can match her astonishing range of vocabulary, I think. Verb-adverb pairs are common in Russian. And very often, both of them, the adverb and the verb, are kind of neutral, right? English frowns on adverbs, though. We don't like adverbs in English, and we prefer to substitute a stronger verb that covers both the action and the description of it. Garnett honestly does this best. Here is a collection of her rich vocabulary. And I repeat, I don't think that this is matched in subsequent translations. I'm not providing English here, and I apologize for that, but I'll read some of these verbs, some of these words, because they just taste so good. Blunders, for ошибки, dumbfounded, поражены, наверное. Puling chicken, I don't even remember what the Russian is for that. Peevish child, blind moles and scoffers. Vile, for zloy. Ignominy, medley of human passions, awe-stricken alarm, profound despondency, for, наверное, печаль, like глубокая печаль, timorous, mortification, inexplicable, humiliating terror, rankling, devilish, and criminal cunning, lacerations. we'll get back to lacerations, nadriv, right, nadrivi, escapade, perplexity. And I'm not going to read them all to you, but I just love her vocabulary, and I just don't see that mastery of English vocabulary. I will say that I think we do need English vocabulary for Russian prose, because the Russian lexicon is really very heavily based on roots that are enhanced by prefixes and suffixes. In English, the different kind of variants of words that are formed from a particular root are going to appear in completely different words that don't share roots at all. And that's our particular strength in English. So moving on, I'd like us to look at some specific words. And these are from the brothers Karamazov. These are notoriously difficult to translate. They don't have good equivalents in English or equivalents that match what Dostoevsky is doing in the original text. And so here are the 7 brothers Karamazov translations. The one missing is Michael Katz, whose book is just going into the press right now, which gives us several months that we have to wait. So klikusha, of course, is a deeply embedded Russian word in Russian folk culture, religious culture. Garnet, and I've got at the bottom of this slide the different translators. Crazy woman, Constance Garnett, that's a little bit neutral, isn't it? Possessed woman, well, this CGDMS, these would be edited versions of Constance Garnett, and then the other 2 translators, Sidney Monis and I believe David Magershak, right? Shrieker, Magershak, PV Volokhinsky, Crazy Village Girl, Andrew McAndrew. And I just want to say that McAndrew's translations are almost always the weakest. A woman prone to hysteria, Julius Katzer. He's just told you what it is, a whaler. Klikusha, just imported into English by Ignat Ovsier. Nadriv, here we go, laceration. That was Constance Garnett. Heartache, Magershak, heartbreak, anguish, strain, crack up, Macduff and crisis, machalka, wisp of toe, that has persisted in translations. Bast sponge, that's a crazy image that Magershak tries to get to work. It does not work. Back scrubber, I'm thinking of that long plastic thing with the brush on the end. Toe beard, maybe whisk broom. Piotr Volokhinsky do a good job, I think. Although again, a whisk broom is a longer thing than somebody's beard. Lufa, Ditio, impossible to translate. The worst is babe, of course, is bad now because it means like a beautiful young lady. Babby is horrible. Magershak is not holding up very well, is he? Bairn, 3 people went for that, and the wee one for Piotr Volokhinsky, which is probably pretty good. Neumestное собрание, remember that? An unfortunate gathering, an inauspicious meeting, an incongruous gathering, an inappropriate gathering, an unseemly encounter. I would like to say, and take a minute here to just comment that when I'm teaching Dostoevsky, or in fact Russian literature, I tell my students to get any translation except for Andrew McAndrew's or any translation that is not abridged and that has a credited translator. And then when we get together in class and look at the text, I do a lot of dramatic reading, I call it, where students read aloud, playing roles from different texts so that students can hear while they read their own text, the differences in translations. This is a really, really good way to teach, by the way. It always brings up something interesting. So sladostrasniki, sensualist, pretty much everybody went for that. The lechers, wow, that's pretty strong. Voluptuaries, maybe pretty good, might be pretty good in this case, right? And that's David Macduff. Tlitvorny duch, the breath of corruption, the odor of corruption, the odor of decay, the smell of decay, the odor of corruption, a putrid smell, odor of putrefaction. You see how that Andrew McAndrew, oops, you know what? I just realized I'm not showing you the slide. I'm sorry about that. We're down here at Tlitvorny duch, and I think probably by now we see that, Andrew McAndrew is pretty much always going to go for an unoriginal kind of option. Sometimes they're mistakes, but I'm not including them here. Liagavi, the character's name, Liagavi, the hound, lurcher. Судебный affect, or is it affect? Aberration in the legal sense, a plea of temporary insanity, legal temporary insanity, a plea of sound mind, legal fit of passion, a judicial affect, legal diminished responsibility, right? Bissionic is a fun one, isn't it? Let's get to that. Sorry about that. I'm missing on the slides. Bissionic, a little demon. Okay, the little imp, a little she-devil, the hell kitten. Andrew McAndrew, the hell kitten. What is that? Adski katyonik. This wonderful thing, I am a wretch. Podle. I'm a wretch. Constance Garnett. We could talk about repetition and how it causes problems for translators. Anyway, mean. Vile, despicable creature, low down creature. I am quite low down. I think I've moved to the next slide accidentally. Right. Katzer, Macduff, I'm vile. You know, this doesn't work very well in English, by the way, just the repetition of words, but Ignat Avsey, bitch. And then this amazing, sort of very challenging, Хождение души по мытарствам, первое, the sufferings of the soul, and the first ordeal, journey through hell, from ordeal to ordeal, the first ordeal, soul's descent into Gehenna, ordeal the first, the soul's journey through torments, the first torment, the passage of a soul through the torments, torment the first, a soul's journey through torment, first torment, right? So it's fun, isn't it? It's really exciting to even look at them and think about the nuances and what's going on in each translator's mind. For the most part, translators are working pretty hard at these difficult points, trying to get it right. So do we need all these translations? I'm skipping, I think that's one. We were still back on question 5, I think. Well, so let me get back to that previous slide so we don't get into что делать yet. I'll just give you a sort of little bit of an answer. Do we really need all these translations? And my answer is no, but maybe. And we can use them, maybe not so much in the sense of like which one single translation is the best one for me to read and all the rest can be thrown into the garbage. But what can we do with all of these translations? Что делать? What is to be done? And this may be just some thoughts for those of you who are doing some research now. And if you are, let me know what you're doing. I'll be super interested. So there's a foxy answer. Number one, this is for teachers. I have my PowerPoint is behaving a little bit funny because I have an animation that's not showing through the Zoom meeting, but there you have it. Again, I'm repeating here, but when I teach in English, I do teach Dostoevsky in English. The students read in English, and for the most part, I have 1 or 2, sometimes students can read some Russian, but certainly not all. I ask them to bring their different translations to class. I assign roles. For example, I might ask one student to read the narrator's role, another student to read Raskolnikov, another one from Sonia, let's say Luzhin, Porfiry Petrovich, whatever the scene might be. But I try and get each role to be from a different translation. And then we do what I call this dramatic reading. The others follow along and I ask them to comment. And so after the readings, and I ask them to interrupt, you know, if they hear something funny, they're to raise their hand and say, look, why did this word come up in the translation? And we talk about it. And my students will leave and your students will leave, you know, the class having an awareness about what translation is and what translators do as interpreters of a work of literature. So that's one answer. Let's use them in the classroom. All of them, even the bad ones, can be useful in a classroom. Second answer is a hedgehoggy answer. I would suggest this is a really good idea that I learned by reading a review of a Crime and Punishment translation. I believe it's a review of, I think it was Nicholas Pasternak Slater's translation of Crime and Punishment. Donald Rayfield suggests that the best translation would be a synoptic version where a translator would get hold of all the different translations and pick the best from all of them and then produce one version. I would just love to see this happen. I would love it so much. And particularly if it was a scholarly version with footnotes and credits, but you know, it's huge. It would be a dissertation, I think, and a wonderfully welcome one. And another answer, and this is a third one, bigger even, hedgehoggier. So that would be take advantage of these incredible resources of big data, leaving behind all the generalizations, post-colonialism, you know, political readings, gender and whatnot, and go back into the text using what big data can give us. Certainly the Russian texts are available, all of them, on easily searchable versions. We are behind. We don't have as many of our translations online, but many are available. And a person, a scholar, could get access to others and get them digitized and study them. Digital humanities is huge. And by the way, I can just give credit to our Canadian colleagues who are doing a really big project in the digital humanities relating to Dostoevsky. They're putting all of our Dostoevsky bibliography from Dostoevsky Studies online. This is going to be searchable, available to everybody, including through our website. So younger scholars who are interested in doing digital humanities, how about a study of how clusters of words come out in English? I'm thinking, for example, clusters relating to devils, demons, possession, right? How does that come out in Dostoevsky? And what can we learn about an interpretation of his novels by studying the way different translators have grappled with it? I think it's, in that sense, all the translations provide more than the original text. That may be a controversial thing, right? But the more interpretations you have, the more you have in terms of the meaning to think about. So I would love to see some of this in the future. Anyway, that is pretty much what I wanted to say. I thank you so much for listening. And I wish, again, that we were together. I wish you the best on this conference. I know it's going to be exciting and brilliant, and you're going to come out of it with a lot of great ideas. I want to hear about it later. So thank you all very much for your attention. Спасибо за внимание.